here, and we're going to talk about that tonight. Still no? Okay, so I had this video to play, Genesis 18, and it had sheep and goat noises in the background, and it was narrated by this really cool voice that I don't have. But I guess I'll read Genesis 18, and then we're going to break it down a little bit. So if you'll turn with me to Genesis 18, I'm going to read the chapter. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree while I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, Do as you have said. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, Where is Sarah your wife? And he said, She is in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh and say, Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, No, but you did. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he had promised him. Then the Lord said, Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered and said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 are righteous, are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for the lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Again he spoke to him and said, Suppose 40 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 40 I will not do it. Then he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 20 I will not destroy it. Then he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 10 I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So that's Genesis 18. That's what we're going to study tonight. So before we do, I just wanted to read over it. And like Caleb said, these are stories that we have probably studied before and that we know, but it's kind of good to refresh ourselves and then rethink about some of the details from time to time. And I know it was good for me to study over this. And so, back to Genesis 18. Let's look at Genesis 18, verses 1 through 5. So the three men are three spiritual heavenly beings. And we're talking about Jesus in the Old Testament here. So these are three spiritual heavenly beings. And they've assumed human bodies, that they might be visible to Abraham and be able to talk with him. So these are not like shining lights or like shadows. They're described as men. So some think that they were all created angels, and others that one of them was the Son of God, the angel of the covenant, whom Abraham distinguished from the rest. So in verse 3, you see that Abraham distinguishes and says, "O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant." And in verse 13, he's called Jehovah. So that gives us a little hint at who we're looking at, that it could be Jesus. And so another thing that we're going to talk about some in this chapter is about hospitality. So I'm going to read Hebrews 13, verses 2. It says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware." So I think that's true in this case. He's entertaining some angels. And so it's a good reminder for us when we're dealing with people that we may not know, strangers or whatnot, to treat them kindly, just as Abraham has done. One thing I want to mention too is that Abraham ran. It says he ran from the tent door. Anybody remember how old Abraham is? 99 years old. It says he bowed himself to the earth. So Abraham's a pretty important guy. So to see somebody like Abraham run out of the tent and bow himself down onto the ground, that's he knows that he's before a pretty important person. So he forgets how important he is. And like I said, powerful men like Abraham don't typically go and bow themselves down. And he calls himself a servant. So that's something when they're appointing new deacons, they sent out to everybody that was a possible new deacon and reminded us that being a deacon is being a servant and not just an appointment of, some grand, it's not like a promotion. It's more of a servanthood. And so it's kind of neat to see Abraham, as important and as a person as he is, run out and bow before the Lord and get so excited. So we're going to move on to verses 6 through 8. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and stood by them under the tree while they ate. So you can see on the screen here, I've pointed out a few things that jumped out to me. One is how excited he is. He runs into Sarah and says, "Quick! We gotta make something happen." How many people here love it when visitors show up at your house unannounced, and then you gotta, make the bed or clean the bathroom or make a meal or whatever that you weren't planning on? That's a challenge. So Abraham ran again. It says he ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man. Then Abraham didn't just snap his hands and say, you go do this, you go do that, and then just him sit and relax.
I'm just thinking that he was eager to serve the Lord. How eager are we when we have opportunity to serve the Lord? Do we jump up and run to serve God some way when we get an opportunity to, or do we just take our time?
Exactly.
90-year-old man
Yeah.
ran to serve the Lord.
Exactly. Good point. So if you didn't hear, he said, how many of us, when we have an opportunity to serve the Lord, are this excited to do it and run and jump at that opportunity? Or how many of us are apprehensive about it? I'll be honest with you, I was really apprehensive about teaching this class because it's the auditorium. I've never taught the auditorium class before, and it's a little intimidating. So, I can face down a criminal in a dark alley, no problem, but standing up here, it's a different kind of tough. So, all right. So, and it says he stood by them under the tree while they ate. And so here again, he stands by them like a waiter at a restaurant. He doesn't sit down with them and relax and act like they're all on the same level. He stands by them in service to them. Anybody else have any comments on that? Yeah.
We don't connect with that really well, but this probably, this may be the beginnings of that hospitality both among the Jews and also among the Arab nations.
Right.
Abraham is the father of both. I don't know if that's the origin of it, but it certainly shows the connection.
All right.
What we see in that culture and how different it is to ours.
Right. So Darrell said that in the Middle East, especially during that time, they took hospitality and treating strangers way more seriously than what we do in our culture here. And that reminds me of the story of the last survivor, Marcus Luttrell. I don't know if anybody's heard that story. In the military, he was a Navy SEAL that survived an attack, and he was the only one that survived this attack. And he was trying to get out of enemy territory, and he found his way into this village, and this family took him into their house and had to hide him and try to keep him alive. And they did so at an amazing risk to their own lives. And this is not that long ago. So that this type of hospitality still exists over there in some areas. All right, verse 9 through 12. They said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She's in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" So this, if you remember back to chapter 17, if you've read Genesis chapter 17, where the Lord appears before Abraham and says, "You're going to have a son in about a year named Isaac," he doesn't mention, Sarah's not mentioned to be there. So we can assume that he told Sarah this, but for some reason these three men, and what I believe is one of them to be Jesus, came for a visit and specifically said, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Well, that tells us that they knew who they were. They knew who Sarah was, and they specifically wanted to make sure she heard this. So Sarah is crucial here. And they tell her that in about a year's time, you're going to have a son. And so she laughed to herself. And I don't think that's such a bad thing. I think You know, if somebody told Paul and Rose they were about to have a son, how would you all react? How would you react, Rose? Would you laugh? Yeah. Yeah, I would laugh too. So Sarah here, she must conceive by faith, and therefore the promise must be made to her. So this is really important about Sarah. Hebrews 11:1. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. So, pretty important about Sarah. We always think about Abraham, but it's pretty important for her. So, Genesis 18:13 through 15, the Lord said to Abraham, get caught up. Why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, no, but you did laugh. So why did Sarah laugh? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? I think more than that, it's hard for us to comprehend the power of the Lord and the miracles. And I mean, how hard is it for us to comprehend a man in Noah's time building the ark and making that thing float? And so how hard is it for a 90-year-old woman to have a child? So don't we often try to cover things up when we do wrong? So what are some other situations in the Bible where people do dumb things because they're afraid? So Sarah was afraid here, and so she denied it. And she probably thought that nobody heard her laugh, or maybe she laughed to herself and nobody did hear it, but God knew about it. So what are some things in the Bible where people did dumb things because they were afraid? Jonah ran away. Right. What else? Adam and Eve hid.
Moses tried to deny.
Yeah, Moses tried to deny. Somebody back there? Peter denied Christ. Yeah. So time and time again, when we're afraid, we do dumb things. And I think that's understandable. But it does remind us that God sees not just what we say, but what we think. So that's a good reminder. That's what I try to remind my son. Just because you don't say it doesn't mean it's not in your heart. So. All right, before we start the next part, is there anything about this that I didn't cover or anything you want to add before we kind of change gears here about the...
I think most of us, when we read this, we understand that Sarah's reaction is not unreasonable.
Right.
She is being asked to believe something which is completely outside of her experience and her understanding. And that's something which God asks of all of us at one time or another in one form or another. Now, we may not have this kind of experience that Sarah had, but we will be asked to believe things that are very difficult to believe.
Right.
You tell your children things that are hard for them to believe with their children.
Right.
So she is understandable, but she is violating faith in the Lord.
Yeah. Well, I think she comes around. Right. Yeah, he laughed as well. Yeah, so they both did. They both had the same reaction. Abraham, I guess it,
It's been interesting to me through the years that Sarah's the one that gets mentioned that frequently. In 17 and verse 17, Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart.
so,
And he was looking at it, you know, he's talking about what they're eating. Looking at it from a physical standpoint.
right, good point. So Abraham did the same thing when he was told about Isaac. He laughed in his heart. And so I don't think that was too unreasonable. Anybody else have any comments on that? But I think the most interesting thing to me about all that is how interested they were in making sure Sarah knew what was going to happen. And so, all right. So we're going to change gears on this second half of their journey. In verse 16. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." Then the Lord said, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know." So the messengers from heaven had now left one part of their business, which is an errand of grace to Abraham and Sarah, which they delivered first. But now they have before them the work of another nature. Sodom is going to be destroyed. And so the Lord enters into a conference with Abraham about destroying Sodom. I thought it was interesting. I underlined the part where Abraham went with them to set them on their way. I thought that was another act of hospitality that, like whenever I go visit my in-laws and we visit and have a good time and it's time for us to leave, we get in the car. It's me and my wife and Cal and the dog, and we're all about to leave to go home, and every time they stand on the porch and they wave until we drive out of sight. And I just think that's pretty sweet. And so Abraham took it a step further and even accompanied them on their way out of town or out of the area. Went with them to set them on their way. So down there in verse 20, he says, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave." So Sodom and Gomorrah, I guess, is known for, their ugly sin. A lot is mentioned about homosexuality and things like that. And so when you read further into a few more chapters, or when they're talking about Lot and talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, basically, it's not just about homosexuality. They're so bad that they will rape other men just for power and control. So, when in our culture we think of homosexuality, we think about a relationship between a man and a man or a woman and a woman. But in this case, it's not even just that. It's like all the men in the entire city were willing to come and rape these angels. And from what I read that was because they wanted power over these new people that just showed up. And they wanted to assert their dominance over them. And I just thought that was pretty wild to think of that. So it's not just about a homosexual relationship. It's about power and control and what the length they will go through for that. And it reminded me there's a piece of our society that is like that today. Can anybody think of what that is? Exactly. He said these kind of things happen in prison. So you think about getting sent to prison and you hear about, men raping men and other men in prison. It's not always because they want companionship. It's because they want dominance. I think that's even, it's just amazing to think about how nasty these people are. Any other comments on that? You put your hand behind your neck, I'm going to think you're going to say something. All right. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood still before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death while the wicked with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And the Lord said, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." So this is where Abraham is getting the opportunity to basically converse or intercede for Sodom. And it kind of shows us the heart of Abraham. When I read this, at first I was like, man, this guy is bold. You know, it sounds kind of like he's talking down to him a little bit. Or, you know, why would you do this? That's the way I first read it. But I don't really think that's Abraham's heart. I think Abraham really is trying to care for the fact that there may be some righteous people down there. And that may be the reason why God chose Abraham in the first place, because he has a heart for righteous people.
Well, when we think of David being a man after God's own heart, here we see Abraham having the heart of God also. And he recognized that when he invited Abraham to find out, to know what was going to happen. He said, "Hey, Abraham's going to be the father of these nations and this great righteous man, so let's let him know what's going on." So they let him know, and sure enough, he takes that opportunity to fight for the underdog, or fight for these individuals that may or may not be righteous out there.
Absolutely. Everybody hear that? I don't know if I can repeat the whole thing. Yes, I meant to mention that. Yeah, his friend Lot actually lived in Sodom, and yeah. But to that point, it's interesting that he didn't just bring up Lot specifically and say, "Hey, you know, can you save my friend Lot down there?" Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's what I'm about to talk about, is where Abraham continues. I'm not going to read this again since I already read this one. It's kind of repetitive, but you know, he goes from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20, all the way down to 10. And I think it's interesting where he says, what he says before he asks. He says, "I am who but dust and ashes." So, you know, I'm just a lowly servant, if you don't mind me saying this. And then he says, "Let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak." And he says, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again." You know, it's just kind of, it tickles me that each time he has a different way of, "Do you mind if I say this?" But it looks to me like he's bartering. You know, he's trying to see, kind of like you know, when you're trying to talk somebody down on a used car or something, where you take this or where you take. But I think he really wants to try to save some good people. So I think it's interesting. Of course, we know that there's not 10 righteous people in Sodom, because the Lord said that he would save them if there were, and he didn't save them. So apparently there was not that many people in Sodom worth saving, and it was that bad to go ahead and wipe them off the face of the earth. Any other comments on that? You guys are doing great. Yes.
Quick comment, a lot of times Abraham probably didn't even think about Sodom up until this point that's going to be destroyed. Then all of a sudden it's like, well, wait, he negotiates with God. But how often, even today, we know destruction is coming. We don't oftentimes think about it until it's real.
Right.
We know it's going to happen. And so I think for him, it's a wake up call of like, oh, this is actually going to happen. I need to take care of that.
Yeah.
It's kind of a wake up call for us.
Yeah. What do we do, when we're hiding in the closet and a tornado's bearing down on our house? We're praying to God to spare us and our family. So, Abraham realizes that God's going to bear down on this city, and he takes that opportunity, even though, he says over and over again, please, if you don't mind me saying, and I think it's interesting when we're scared or afraid for our safety, we may not have been living the way we should, or we may not have been praying the way we should, but in that moment, we don't mind coming to God and saying, help me out. I really need you right now. So, yes.
We see here God in the tension between two aspects of God, his mercy and his justice. And we see that God's mercy goes even down to 10 people,
Right.
10 righteous people. But we see the tension that's going on there between that justice and mercy. And God's resolution of that tension is also expressed in this chapter in Jesus, ultimate fulfillment of all the promises that are being given to Abraham and Sarah. Because mercy is being shown to them by giving them a son. But that's not the big reason. The big reason is a long picture
Right.
of the ultimate mercy through Jesus
Exactly.
expressed down.
Yeah. So he's saying this shows us that the mercy of God, that he's willing to go all the way down to 10 and save 10. That shows God's mercy. And of course, the long view of that is that, Abraham came before Jesus, but Jesus was the Savior that came along to save everyone in the whole world, not just Sodom. And so, any other comments on that?
One of the last things I struck with is we think of Peter. Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter was annoyed. I got kind of confused by that. Here, Abraham asked 5 times, and there's no sense of annoyment or anything.
Right.
It's just a clear answer. And the patience that our God has with us is infallible.
Yeah. So God allowed them to ask 5 times and didn't even get annoyed with Abraham for doing so, or at least it doesn't say anything about it. So, it's a good point.
I kind of wonder if Abraham's having a shock moment. Here, Lot chose Sodom. Lot chose that area to settle.
Yeah.
And maybe Abraham's thinking, has he really settled in a place that is this back? I'm sure he heard the stories.
Yeah.
And we know that he had influence in his house. Maybe he's just baffled that Lot has not brought anybody to know God. He's not shared his faith with
Yeah.
anybody there. And it's like not even 50. And he's going down. Just really sort of just blown away by how that's.
Yeah.
I can see that might be part of this too.
And it doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us if Abraham knew how bad Sodom was, but I like to think that maybe there's a reason Abraham was living in the suburbs. You know what I mean? So maybe he had some kind of idea, but it doesn't say.
You might appreciate this, especially with law enforcement, but it seems like it's kind of a courtroom motif here as well, because there's a complaint that's been lodged, right? It's come up, a cry that's come up before God about the wickedness of Sodom. And of course, he's going to verify that and execute judgment. And you have Abraham being an interceder and an advocate for the righteous that live in Sodom, speaking
Exactly. Yeah, he said it's kind of like a courtroom where you may go before the judge and plead your case, and Abraham is going before the Lord here and pleading a case for the righteous. And so I had some notes on here. Communion with God is kept up by the Word and by prayer. So in the Word, God speaks to us. In prayer, we speak to Him. So God has revealed to Abraham his purpose concerning Sodom. Now from this, Abraham takes occasion to speak to God on Sodom's behalf. So when God has spoken to us through the Word, we must consider what we have to say to Him upon that. And also, we must pray for others, not just ourselves. We are all members of one body, so we should be praying for those in other places where they need God and they need help. And so I think that's a good application for us to remember that we can also plead our case to God through prayer, and that He does speak to us through His Word. All right, so what do you notice in Genesis 18 that is similar to Jesus? Yeah, he was willing to go before God for everyone. Okay. Any other thoughts? Both loyal servants? Oh, yes, both brought low as a servant. Yes. So I'm sorry? Yes. Yeah, God came, yeah. So here's what I put. Abraham is a servant. In verse 3, he brings water to wash the feet of these three visitors. And Jesus washes the disciples' feet and calls them to be a servant. So I kind of saw those two things as similar. And then, Sarah will miraculously conceive in Genesis 18:13. And it says, "Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?" And Mary, in Luke 1:34, says almost the same thing, except it's not about her age. She says, "How will this be since I'm a virgin?" So I thought that was kind of a neat comparison. Yes, Isaac. Yeah. Oh, yes, for the meal. Yeah, he sacrifices a calf for their meal. Yeah. So I thought it was kind of neat, the comparison there with Sarah and Mary. And then Abraham seeks to save the righteous in Sodom, and Jesus seeks to save the righteous of the world. Luke 19:10, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. So I think we already talked about that, but that's a big comparison there. Right.
How could this be Jehovah and still be speaking to Abraham and to the others face to face? And so one solution to that that's been offered is that this person is the pre-incarnate Christ, because he's in the flesh, he's speaking to man face to face, and yet Abraham lives through the experience.
Right.
So how else do you reconcile it? It's a knotty problem.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I didn't really bring it up because you mentioned that a few times, and I didn't want to keep repeating that, but we probably should anyways, that nobody has ever seen God. And so I guess in this case, the Lord comes in the form of a man, which we see again, when Jesus is born. But probably didn't sum that up very good. All right. Got a few more real quick comparisons. Abraham is called the father of faith, and Christ is the author and perfecter of our faith. And Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only son, and Isaac was ready to do what his father said, and God the Father was willing to sacrifice his only son, and Jesus was ready to do what his father said. So we didn't really get to that part, but that's a pretty close comparison there. Is that it, or is that the 5 minute? That's it? All right. I just had these and a couple more, so I was about done. Timed it just about right. Thank you all for your comments. I appreciate it very much. The more you all comment, the less I have to try to talk. So y'all did great.